July 24, 1943, 2:47 a.m. Inside a German radar station near Cuxhaven on the North Sea coast. Unteroffizier Klaus Weber stares at his Würzburg radar display. For 3 years, this equipment has been his weapon. Every night, he tracks British bombers crossing into German airspace. He guides night fighters to intercept them. He's helped shoot down dozens of RAF aircraft. Tonight, something is wrong. The screen shows dozens of targets, then hundreds. Then the entire display fills with white noise. Targets appear, multiply, disappear. Some move at impossible speeds. Others hover motionless. The precision tracking system he's relied on for 3 years has become meaningless. Weber calls his supervisor. Across northern Germany, every radar station reports the same thing. The screens are filled with ghosts. German night fighter controllers try to vector their aircraft toward the bomber stream. But which targets are real? Which are phantoms? The pilots receive contradictory instructions. Some chase echoes that vanish. Others fly past actual bombers they can't see. The Kammhuber line, the sophisticated radar defense network that has protected Germany for 3 years, is blind. Above, 791 RAF bombers pass through the German defenses almost unopposed. They drop nearly 2,300 tons of bombs on Hamburg, and they drop something else. Thousands upon thousands of strips of aluminum foil, each one precisely cut to 27 centimeters long. Tinfoil. Simple, cheap, elegant. And it has just rendered the most advanced radar system in the world completely useless. The RAF loses only 12 aircraft that night. The expected loss rate was 10 times higher. The German radar operators sit in stunned silence, watching their screens fill with false targets they cannot distinguish from real bombers. For 3 years, Britain possessed this weapon. For 3 years, the RAF begged to use it. And for 3 years, Winston Churchill refused authorization, terrified that Germany would copy it and use it against British radar defenses. Tonight, that 3-year debate ended, and the air war over Germany changed forever. This is the story of Operation Window, the radar countermeasure so simple that a child could understand it, yet so effective that it paralyzed the German air defense system and helped turn Hamburg into the greatest firestorm in modern warfare. To understand why Operation Window mattered, we need to understand the nightmare facing RAF Bomber Command between 1940 and 1943. Night after night, British bombers flew into Germany, and night after night, they died in staggering numbers. In 1942, Bomber Command's average loss rate was approximately 5% per mission. This sounds small until you understand what it meant. A bomber crew was required to complete 30 operational missions before being rotated off combat duty. Simple mathematics showed that at a 5% loss rate, fewer than 25% of crews would survive their tour. The casualty rate among RAF bomber crews was higher than British infantry officers in World War I. Flying with Bomber Command was statistically one of the most dangerous assignments of the entire war. The reason was German radar. Germany had developed 2 primary radar systems. The first was Freya, a long-range, early warning radar that could detect incoming aircraft at distances up to 120 kilometers. Freya gave German controllers advance notice of RAF raids, allowing time to scramble night fighters and prepare ground defenses. The second system was Würzburg, a precision tracking radar with a range of about 40 kilometers but much better accuracy. Würzburg could track individual aircraft and provide exact altitude, bearing, and distance information to night fighter controllers and anti-aircraft batteries. These systems were integrated into the Kammhuber line, named after General Joseph Kammhuber, the architect of Germany's night air defense. The Kammhuber line divided German airspace into a grid of defensive boxes, each monitored by radar and patrolled by night fighters. When Freya detected incoming bombers, The information was passed to Würzburg stations. The Würzburg operators would track individual aircraft and guide night fighters to intercept them. The night fighters themselves carried airborne radar called Liechtenstein, which could detect bombers at ranges of about 4 kilometers, allowing the fighters to close for the kill. This system was devastatingly effective. German night fighter aces like Helmut Lent and Heinrich zu sein Wittgenstein shot down dozens of British bombers using radar-guided interception. RAF Bomber Command AUS tried everything to reduce losses. They flew in concentrated bomber streams to overwhelm individual defensive boxes. They used electronic warfare aircraft to jam German radar. They varied routes and timings to confuse defenders. Nothing worked well enough. The losses continued. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, knew his crews were being slaughtered. He needed a way to blind German radar, and British scientists had already invented one. In 1937, a researcher named R.V. Jones first proposed using metal strips to create false radar echoes. The idea was based on fundamental physics. Radar works by transmitting radio waves and detecting reflections from objects. Any metal object can reflect radio waves. If you cut metal strips to exactly half the wavelength of the radar you want to deceive, those strips become highly efficient reflectors. German Würzburg radar operated at a wavelength of approximately 53 centimeters. Cut aluminum strips to 27 centimeters, and they become perfect radar reflectors. Drop thousands of these strips from bombers, and radar screens fill with false targets. In 1942, Dr. Joan Curran at the Telecommunications Research Establishment refined the concept. She developed the practical implementation: bundles of aluminum-coated paper strips, bound together with string, designed to be dropped from bombers through a simple chute. The British gave it the codename Window. Tests proved it worked perfectly. In trials, a single aircraft dropping Window could create radar echoes that looked like dozens of bombers. Radar operators couldn't distinguish real aircraft from chaff. The technology to filter out false echoes didn't exist yet. RAF Bomber Command immediately requested authorization to use Window operationally. The year was 1942. British bombers were dying at horrific rates. Window could save hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. But authorization was denied, not by military commanders, but by the British government at the highest level. The decision went all the way to Winston Churchill himself. And Churchill said no. The technical development of Window began in 1937, but the serious work happened at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE, located in Malvern, Worcestershire. TRE was Britain's primary radar research facility. The scientists there developed Chain Home, the radar network that helped win the Battle of Britain. They developed airborne intercept radar for British night fighters. They developed H2S ground mapping radar for navigation. And they developed Window. Dr. Joan Curran led the Window development team. She was one of the few women working at TRE in a senior scientific role, and her work on radar countermeasures was brilliant. Curran understood that the key variables were wavelength, material, and dispersal pattern. The aluminum strips had to be precisely cut to half the wavelength of German radar. They had to be lightweight enough to stay airborne for several minutes, creating a long-lasting cloud of false echoes. And they had to be bundled in a way that allowed easy deployment from bomber aircraft. The final design used aluminum foil, backed with paper for structural support. Each strip measured 27 centimeters long and approximately 1.5 centimeters wide. The strips were bound into bundles weighing about 100 grams, with roughly 2,000 strips per bundle. A bomber would carry hundreds of these bundles. Crew members would drop bundles down a chute at regular intervals, typically one bundle per minute. As the bundles fell, they would separate, creating a cloud of chaff that reflected radar waves. From the ground, a Würzburg radar operator would see dozens or hundreds of targets appear where only one bomber actually existed. Even better, the chaff fell slowly, creating long-lasting false echoes that continued to confuse radar long after the bombers had passed. In test after test, Window worked flawlessly. RAF radar stations reported that their screens became completely unreadable when Window was deployed. Tracking individual aircraft became impossible. This is where the terrible dilemma emerged. If Window could blind German radar, it could also blind British radar. Britain's air defense depended on the chain-home radar network. This system of coastal radar stations provided early warning of German air attacks. RAF fighter controllers used chain-home data to intercept German bombers and V-1 flying bombs. If Britain used Window, Germany would immediately understand the principle. German scientists would examine recovered window strips, determine the dimensions and materials, and develop their own version within weeks. When Germany deployed chaff against British radar, the chain-home network would become useless. German bombers could attack Britain with impunity. V-1 flying bombs would be impossible to track and intercept. This wasn't theoretical fear. It was tactical reality. Whoever deployed chaff first would gain a temporary advantage, but both sides would quickly lose the ability to use radar effectively. The question facing British leadership was stark. Should the RAF use Window to save bomber crews, knowing it would give Germany the same capability to blind British air defenses? Air Chief Marshal Harris argued passionately for immediate use. Every night, his crews died because of German radar. Window could cut loss rates by half, maybe more. Thousands of lives hung in the balance. But Air Ministry leadership and the Chiefs of Staff disagreed. Britain was an island nation dependent on air defense. Germany had largely given up strategic bombing of Britain by 1942. The Blitz was over. German air attacks were rare and limited. If Window provoked a renewed German bombing campaign using chaff to blind British radar, British cities could be devastated. The V-1 flying bomb offensive was expected to begin soon. Without radar, stopping V-1s would be nearly impossible. The debate raged through 1942. Scientists supported Harris. They argued that Germany probably already knew about chaff and simply hadn't used it yet. The physics was straightforward. Any competent radar researcher could conceive of the idea. But intelligence analysts disagreed. Ultra-intercepts of German communications showed no indication that Germany had developed or even seriously considered chaff countermeasures. If Germany didn't know about it yet, why give them the idea? The decision went to the War Cabinet, and ultimately to Winston Churchill himself. Churchill was torn. He understood the losses Bomber Command was suffering. He also understood the strategic risk to British air defense. Month after month, he postponed the decision. Throughout 1942, RAF bomber crews continued dying at a rate of 5% per mission. The casualty lists grew longer. Harris sent increasingly urgent requests for Window authorization. Churchill continued to refuse. The political and ethical dimensions of this decision are extraordinary. Churchill held in his hands a weapon that could save thousands of British lives immediately. Using it meant accepting a risk that German cities would burn, but British cities might burn too if Germany retaliated with their own version. It was a utilitarian calculation of lives against lives, certainty against possibility, the present against the future. And for 18 months, Churchill chose to wait. The Window debate became one of the most contentious strategic disagreements within the British government during World War II. By early 1943, the arguments had crystallized into two opposing camps. The first camp, led by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris and supported by most RAF Bomber Command personnel, argued for immediate deployment. Their reasoning was direct and brutal. British airmen were dying every night because German radar was effective. Window could neutralize that advantage immediately. The moral obligation to protect your own forces outweighed hypothetical future risks. Harris was not a subtle man. His nickname was Bomber Harris, and he believed in the strategic bombing campaign with almost religious fervor. But his advocacy for Window wasn't about aggression. It was about survival. He watched his crews face impossible odds. He read casualty reports every morning. He knew the statistics. At current loss rates, most bomber crews would not survive their tour of duty. In a memo to the Air Ministry dated March 1943, Harris wrote, "We are sending young men to die in numbers that would not be tolerated in any other branch of service, and we possess a simple countermeasure that could cut those losses in half. Every week, we delay costs lives. The decision to withhold Window is, in my opinion, indefensible." The second camp, led by Air Defense Command and supported by much of the Air Ministry staff, argued for continued delay. Their reasoning was strategic. Britain's survival depended on radar. The chain home network was the only effective early warning system against German air attack. German V-weapon offensives were expected to begin soon. If Germany gained the ability to blind British radar, the consequences could be catastrophic. Air Marshal Roderick Hill, commander of Air Defense of Great Britain, wrote in a counter-memo, "Bomber Command's losses, while tragic, do not threaten Britain's survival. A German air offensive that we cannot detect or intercept does threaten our survival. We must not sacrifice strategic defense for tactical advantage." The chiefs of staff were divided. Some supported Harris, others supported Hill. The debate reached the War Cabinet multiple times through late 1942 and early 1943. Intelligence assessments added another layer of complexity. Ultra-intercepts provided excellent insight into German military communications. Analysts at Bletchley Park searched for any indication that Germany had developed or even considered chaff countermeasures. They found nothing. German radar development focused on improving accuracy and range, not on countermeasures. German night fighter tactics assumed radar would remain reliable. There was no evidence of defensive preparations against jamming or deception. This cut both ways. Some argued it proved Germany didn't know about chaff, so using Window would hand them a new capability. Others argued that Germany's ignorance was itself an advantage worth exploiting immediately. R.V. Jones, the head of British scientific intelligence, supported immediate use of Window. In his post-war memoir, Most Secret War, Jones described the Window debate as an example of excessive caution overriding tactical necessity. He believed Germany would eventually develop chaff independently, so Britain should use it while they still had the advantage of surprise. But Jones wasn't making the final decision. That responsibility fell to Winston Churchill. Churchill approached the problem methodically. He commissioned multiple studies. He consulted with scientists, military commanders, and intelligence analysts. He personally reviewed the casualty statistics from Bomber Command. But he also understood the political dimensions. If he authorized Window and Germany responded by launching a devastating bombing campaign against British cities, he would be held personally responsible. The British public, after enduring the Blitz, would not easily forgive leadership that provoked renewed bombing. Throughout 1942, Churchill consistently sided with caution. He postponed authorization multiple times, requesting more analysis, more assurances, more contingency planning. By early 1943, the situation had changed in ways that made Window less risky. German bomber strength on the Western Front had diminished significantly. Most Luftwaffe resources were committed to the Eastern Front and to defending German airspace against increasing Allied bombing. The likelihood of a major German bombing offensive against Britain had decreased substantially. Additionally, British air defenses had improved. RAF night fighter squadrons now had effective airborne intercept radar. Anti-aircraft artillery had been reinforced. Around major cities, ground-controlled intercept techniques had advanced. Even if Germany deployed chaff against British radar, air defense would not be completely blind. The V-weapon threat remained, but intelligence suggested the V-1 offensive was still months away. When it came, defending against V-1s would require different tactics than defending against manned bombers. In June 1943, Churchill finally made his decision. He authorized the use of window for a single major operation, the bombing of Hamburg. The authorization came with conditions. Window would be used only over German territory, never over occupied France or the Low Countries, to minimize the chance of Germany recovering intact samples and analyzing them quickly. RAF Bomber Command would deploy window in maximum concentration, overwhelming German radar completely to maximize the shock effect. Churchill's decision was accompanied by a personal letter to Harris. In it, Churchill acknowledged the terrible weight of the choice. He wrote that he prayed the decision would save British lives without costing more British lives in German retaliation. He also noted that if Germany did retaliate with their own chaff, Britain would face that challenge when it came, but not before. The ethical dimensions of Churchill's decision are complex. He delayed for 18 months while British airmen died, but he also avoided potentially provoking a renewed German bombing campaign during a period when British cities were vulnerable. When he finally authorized window, it was at a moment when the strategic balance had shifted in Britain's favor. History does not provide a clear verdict on whether Churchill made the right choice. What is clear is that once the decision was made, the consequences were immediate and dramatic. In late June 1943, RAF Bomber Command began preparing for Operation Gomorrah, a series of massive raids targeting Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city and one of its most important industrial centers. Hamburg was a critical target. The city contained major shipyards, U-boat construction facilities, oil refineries, and industrial plants, producing everything from tanks to aircraft engines. The port of Hamburg was Germany's primary gateway for imports of Swedish iron ore and other strategic materials. The city had also been heavily bombed before. RAF Bomber Command had attacked Hamburg repeatedly since 1940 with limited success. German air defenses around Hamburg were strong, featuring multiple Würzburg radar stations, extensive anti-aircraft artillery, and bases for experienced night fighter squadrons. Previous raids on Hamburg had been costly. Loss rates sometimes exceeded 8%, far above the already high average. Hamburg's defenses were organized, effective, and lethal. Operation Gomorrah would be different. This time, the RAF would deploy window. In early July, selected bomber crews received classified briefings about the new countermeasure. The briefings were deliberately vague about how window worked. Crews were told only that they would be dropping bundles of metal strips that would confuse German radar. Each Lancaster bomber was equipped to carry approximately 2,000 bundles of window, weighing about 200 kilograms in total. This load was in addition to the bomb load crews had to make space by reducing other supplies or slightly decreasing the bomb tonnage. The bundles were stored in the fuselage near the flare chute, a small opening in the bomber's belly typically used for dropping marker flares. The bundles would be pushed down this chute by crew members, usually the navigator or bomb aimer when not occupied with other duties. The instructions were precise. Drop one bundle every minute throughout the mission, from the moment the bomber crossed the enemy coast until the moment it returned to friendly airspace. Do not stop. Do not delay. Maintain a steady rhythm of one bundle per minute. Some crews were skeptical. Flight Lieutenant Robert W.C. Rosie Wally, a Lancaster pilot with 78 Squadron, later recalled his reaction to the briefing. "They told us we'd be dropping strips of aluminum foil to confuse German radar. I thought it sounded mad. How could tinfoil possibly stop radar? I didn't believe it would work, but orders were orders." Ground crews loaded the window bundles into bombers on the afternoon of July 24th. 1943. The target for that night, Hamburg. The force would consist of 791 bombers, mostly Lancasters and Halifaxes, carrying over 2,000 tons of bombs. The bombers began taking off from bases across eastern England shortly after 9 p.m. They formed into a concentrated bomber stream, a tactic designed to overwhelm individual German defensive boxes by saturating them with targets. As the bombers climbed to operational altitude and set course for Germany, crew members prepared the window bundles. Navigators and bomb aimers positioned themselves near the flare chutes. They had stopwatches and bundles ready. At approximately 12:50 a.m. on July 25th, the first RAF bombers crossed the German coast near Cuxhaven. As they entered German airspace, crew members began dropping window. Bundle after bundle tumbled down the flare chute, into the night, into the slipstream. Each bundle separated as it fell, releasing 2,000 strips of aluminum foil that fluttered downward, reflecting radar waves. Below, in German radar stations across northern Germany, screens began to fill with echoes. 30 to 40. The first use, the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943. At 12:57 a.m., Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, the radar operator we met at the beginning of this story, was staring at his Würzburg display at the radar station near Cuxhaven. He saw the first echoes appear. A few targets, perhaps a dozen, crossing the coast. This was normal. The RAF often sent preliminary reconnaissance aircraft or Pathfinder squadrons ahead of the main bomber force. Then, within seconds, the dozen targets became 50, then 100. Then the entire screen filled with returns. Weber's immediate thought was that his equipment had malfunctioned. He checked connections, cycled power, adjusted calibration. The echoes remained. If anything, they intensified. His supervisor, Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, came over to look. Müller had 3 years of radar operation experience. He'd tracked hundreds of RAF raids. He'd never seen anything like this. Müller called the central control station at Stade. "We have a screen full of returns. Unable to count individual targets. Request guidance." The response came back. Multiple stations reporting the same problem. Attempt to identify actual bomber stream by tracking movement patterns. Müller and Weber tried. Some echoes moved at speeds consistent with bomber aircraft, roughly 300 kilometers per hour, but many echoes moved slower or drifted sideways or appeared stationary. Some targets would appear, intensify, then fade away. Others would split into multiple contacts. The two operators tried focusing on echoes moving at bomber speed, but even these were unreliable. Which were real bombers? Which were false returns? There was no way to tell. At the Night Fighter Control Center at Stade, controllers faced complete chaos. They were receiving reports from dozens of radar stations, all reporting the same problem. Screens full of contacts, unable to distinguish real bombers from phantoms. The controller responsible for vectoring night fighters to intercept the bomber stream had built his entire tactical doctrine around precise radar tracking. He would receive position updates from Würzburg stations, calculate intercept vectors, and guide night fighters to positions where their airborne Liechtenstein radar could acquire the bombers. Tonight, none of that worked. He had position reports for hundreds of targets, most of which were probably false. He vectored night fighters toward clusters of contacts. The pilots reported finding nothing, or they reported contacts in completely different locations from what ground radar showed. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen was flying a Bf-110 night fighter, with Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 that night. In his post-war memoir, he described the confusion. Ground control vectored us toward a large formation. My radar operator could see nothing on his Liechtenstein scope. We flew the assigned heading for 10 minutes, seeing nothing, while ground control insisted the targets were directly ahead of us. Then control gave us a new heading, completely different. We turned, flew that heading, still nothing. We were chasing ghosts. Some night fighters got lucky. A few made visual contact with bombers silhouetted against searchlights or fires on the ground. But without radar guidance to bring them close to the bomber stream initially, the night fighters were reduced to random patrolling, hoping to stumble across targets by chance. This was exactly what RAF Bomber Command had hoped for. The concentrated bomber stream tactic assumed some night fighters would make contact, but without radar to guide them efficiently, the number of successful interceptions would drop dramatically. As the bomber stream approached Hamburg, German anti-aircraft artillery opened fire. Flak batteries had their own Würzburg radar for fire control. These radars were experiencing the same problems. Screens full of false echoes, unable to track individual targets accurately. Flak guns began firing barrage patterns, filling sections of sky with exploding shells rather than attempting to track specific aircraft. This was less effective than radar-directed fire, but it was the only option available. RAF bombers flew through the flak. Crews saw the explosions, felt the concussions, heard shrapnel rattling against the aircraft's skin. But the flak was scattered, undirected. Far fewer bombers were being hit than on previous Hamburg raids. At 1:02 a.m., the first Pathfinder aircraft dropped marker flares over Hamburg. These were colored flares designed to mark the aiming point for following bombers. The technique, developed over 2 years of night bombing operations, relied on specially trained Pathfinder crews identifying targets using H2S ground mapping radar and visual observation. The main bomber stream arrived over Hamburg between 1:05 and 1:15 a.m. Bomb aimers identified the marker flares, made their final aiming adjustments, and released their loads. Nearly 2,300 tons of bombs fell on Hamburg in approximately 20 minutes. The mix included high-explosive bombs to blast buildings apart and thousands of incendiary bombs to start fires. The concentration of the attack was unprecedented. Previous raids had been more scattered, with bombs landing across a wider area as crews struggled to identify targets under fire. Tonight, with German defenses disrupted, bomber crews had more time to aim carefully. The bombs fell in a concentrated pattern across the city center. Fires started almost immediately. The weather conditions were dry, and a hot summer had left wooden structures and vegetation tinder dry. Incendiary bombs ignited buildings, and the fires spread rapidly. German civil defense crews responded, but the scale of the attack overwhelmed them. Water mains were damaged by high-explosive bombs. Fire brigades couldn't reach many areas because streets were blocked by rubble. RAF bomber crews turned for home. They continued dropping window throughout the return flight. German radar remained confused, unable to track the departing bombers effectively. Of 791 bombers that attacked Hamburg that night, only 12 were lost. The loss rate was 1.5%. The previous RAF raid on Hamburg, on July 17th, had lost 17 aircraft out of 323, a loss rate of 5.2%. If the July 24th raid had suffered similar losses, approximately 40 bombers would have been destroyed. Window had saved 28 bombers. Approximately 200 airmen who would have died instead flew home safely. In Hamburg, the fires burned through the night. Civil defense services struggled to contain them. By dawn, large sections of the city center were destroyed. Casualty estimates from this first raid ranged from 1,500 to 2,000 dead. This was just the beginning. Operation Gomorrah would continue for 10 days, with multiple raids by both RAF Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces. The cumulative destruction would be catastrophic. But the most important result of the July 24th raid wasn't the physical damage to Hamburg. It was the psychological impact on German air defense. For 3 years, German radar had been reliable, effective, and nearly impossible to deceive. German night fighter pilots trusted their radar guidance. German High Command had built the entire air defense system around radar technology. In a single night, that confidence was shattered. German radar was vulnerable. The RAF had found a way to blind it, and Germany had no countermeasure ready. The morning of July 25, 1943, German Air Defense Headquarters was in crisis. Reports flooded in from radar stations across northern Germany. Every station reported the same problem. Massive numbers of false echoes during the Hamburg raid. Equipment checks revealed no malfunctions. The radar systems were working correctly. The problem was the targets themselves. By mid-morning, German intelligence had recovered samples of window from areas where the RAF bomber stream had passed. The strips were analyzed immediately. The conclusion was obvious and devastating. The RAF had deployed radar countermeasures consisting of simple aluminum strips cut to precise lengths corresponding to German radar wavelengths. The technology was not sophisticated. Any nation with basic understanding of radar physics could have developed it. General Joseph Kammhuber, the commander of Germany's night fighter force, was furious. He had spent 3 years building the Kammhuber line into the most effective air defense system in the world. He had overseen the deployment of hundreds of radar stations. He had developed the tactics that made German night fighters so deadly. In a single night, the RAF had rendered his entire system nearly useless. Kammhuber demanded immediate solutions from German radar manufacturers and research institutes. He convened emergency meetings with technical specialists. He wanted countermeasures deployed within weeks. The technical specialists had no good news. The fundamental problem with radar chaff is that it exploits basic physics. Radar works by detecting reflected radio waves. Metal strips reflect radio waves efficiently. From the radar's perspective, a cloud of metal strips is indistinguishable from solid metal objects, like aircraft. Modern radar systems can filter out chaff using Doppler processing, which distinguishes targets based on their relative motion. But 1943 radar technology didn't have this capability. The circuits required to process Doppler information didn't exist yet. German engineers proposed several potential solutions, none of them immediately practical. The first proposal was to change radar frequencies. If German radar operated at a different wavelength, the current window strips would be ineffective. The RAF would need to produce new strips cut to different lengths. This solution had 2 problems. First, changing frequencies required modifying or replacing every radar system in Germany, a massive undertaking that would take months. Second, once Germany changed frequencies, the RAF would simply measure the new wavelength and produce appropriately sized window strips. It was a temporary fix at best. The second proposal was to use multiple radar frequencies simultaneously. If different radar stations operated at different wavelengths, the RAF couldn't jam all of them with a single window design. This was more promising, but still slow to implement. Germany would need to manufacture radar systems operating at multiple frequencies and deploy them across the air defense network. The production capacity didn't exist to do this quickly. The third proposal was to abandon radar-based interception and rely on visual tactics. German night fighters would patrol designated areas, use searchlights and ground-based illumination to spot bombers visually, then attack without radar guidance. This was the only solution that could be implemented immediately, but it was far less effective than radar interception. Visual tactics required night fighters to be in exactly the right place at the right time by chance. The vast majority of night fighter patrols would see nothing. Loss rates for RAF bombers would increase slightly, but nowhere near the 5 to 8% rates achieved with radar guidance. Kammhuber authorized immediate implementation of visual tactics while pushing for longer-term technical solutions. German night fighter tactics were revised. A new method called Wilde Sau, or wild boar, was developed by Major Hajo Hermann. Wilde Sau tactics use single-engine day fighters, primarily Bf-109S and FW-190S, flying over cities during bombing raids. The fighters would use the light from fires and searchlights to spot bombers visually, then attack. This was dangerous for the German pilots, who risked mid-air collisions, ground fire from their own flak batteries, and navigation difficulties in darkness. Wildesau achieved some successes, but it was a desperation measure, not a systematic solution. Many German fighters crashed on landing or were shot down by their own anti-aircraft guns. Pilot losses in Wildesau units were high. The broader strategic problem for Germany was that the RAF's use of window revealed a fundamental vulnerability in German air defense doctrine. Germany had invested heavily in radar technology without developing adequate countermeasures or backup systems. When radar failed, the entire defensive structure collapsed. This pattern would repeat throughout the remaining years of the war. Germany developed excellent technology but lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and strategic flexibility to adapt when enemies found counters. By August 1943, German scientists had developed their own version of window, which they called Düppel. The German Luftwaffe began using Düppel against British and American radar systems in late 1943. But by then, Allied air defenses had already developed tactics to mitigate chaff. RAF fighter controllers learned to recognize chaff clouds on radar and distinguish them from actual aircraft by observing movement patterns. British radar researchers developed improved circuits that could filter some false echoes. More importantly, by late 1943, Germany had largely abandoned strategic bombing against Britain. The Luftwaffe was focused on defending German airspace against massive Allied bombing campaigns. German use of Düppel had limited impact because Germany was no longer conducting large-scale offensive air operations. The V-1 flying bomb offensive, which began in June 1944, did pose challenges for British radar. V-1s flew at low altitude and constant speed, making them difficult to distinguish from chaff, but British defenders adapted. They deployed barrage balloons, positioned anti-aircraft guns along the V-1 flight paths, and used fast fighters like the Hawker Tempest and de Havilland Mosquito for visual intercepts. Window had achieved exactly what British strategists feared in 1942. It had neutralized radar as a reliable defense tool, forcing both sides to develop new tactics, but the timing of Window's deployment worked in Britain's favor. By July 1943, Britain was no longer defending against sustained German air attack. Germany was the nation dependent on radar for air defense, and Germany paid the price. Adolf Hitler personally demanded explanations for the Hamburg disaster. He wanted to know why German technology had failed, why air defenses had been powerless, and why he hadn't been warned that such a countermeasure was possible. The answers he received were unsatisfying. German radar research had focused on improving detection and accuracy, not on defensive countermeasures. No one had seriously considered that the enemy might deploy massive amounts of chaff to blind radar systematically. This was a failure of imagination, not of technical capability. German scientists certainly could have invented Window or Düppel years earlier. They simply never prioritized it because they assumed radar would remain reliable. In military technology, the defender's dilemma is constant. You must anticipate every possible threat, while the attacker only needs to find one vulnerability you didn't protect. Against Germany failed to anticipate Window, and that failure cost them air superiority over their own cities. The immediate impact of Operation Window was measured in the destruction of Hamburg. The RAF conducted multiple raids on Hamburg between July 24th and August 3rd. 1943 American bombers from the 8th Air Force also participated, conducting daylight raids. The cumulative result was catastrophic. On the night of July 27th to 28th, the third major RAF raid created a firestorm that killed approximately 42,000 people in a single night. This remains one of the most deadly air raids of World War II. A firestorm occurs when numerous fires merge into a single, massive conflagration that generates its own weather system. The intense heat creates powerful updrafts that draw in oxygen from surrounding areas, creating hurricane-force winds at ground level. These winds fan the flames and spread fire even faster. People in Hamburg's shelters suffocated as the firestorm consumed all available oxygen. Others were burned alive. Many died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The civilian death toll from Operation Gomorrah across all raids is estimated at 42,000 to 46,000, with approximately 37,000 injured and nearly 1 million rendered homeless. These numbers are staggering and tragic. The ethical questions surrounding strategic bombing remain controversial decades later. But from a military perspective, Operation Gomorrah demonstrated that Window had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the air war over Germany. RAF Bomber Command loss rates dropped dramatically after Window was deployed. For the remainder of 1943, average losses per mission were typically between 2 and 3%, compared to 5% or higher before Window. This reduction saved thousands of lives. RAF bomber crews still faced enormous risks. 2 to 3% losses were still high by any measure, but the improvement was significant. Lower loss rates also meant more experienced crews survived to complete tours of duty, train new crews, and pass on tactical knowledge. The quality of Bomber Command improved as veteran crews accumulated experience instead of being killed before they could become expert. Window also changed German industrial strategy. After Hamburg, German cities implemented more extensive civil defense measures, including better shelter construction, fire prevention systems, and evacuation plans. Resources that could have been used for military production went into civil defense instead. The German night fighter force expanded dramatically in late 1943 and 1944, attempting to counter the increasing Allied bombing campaign. At its peak, the German night fighter force included over 1,000 aircraft and tens of thousands of personnel. This represented a massive diversion of resources. The aircraft, pilots, fuel, and support infrastructure used for night fighters could have been used on other fronts. The aluminum and electronics used for radar stations could have been used for tanks, ships, or offensive weapons. Germany was forced into a defensive posture, reacting to Allied air attacks rather than pursuing offensive operations. This defensive focus consumed resources and initiative that Germany could not afford to lose. Window also sparked an electronic warfare arms race. Both sides developed increasingly sophisticated radar and countermeasures throughout the remainder of the war. The RAF introduced Mandrel, a radar jamming system. They developed Monica, a tail-warning radar for bombers. They deployed SER-8, a device that homed in on German night fighter radar emissions. Each innovation prompted German counter-innovations. This electronic warfare competition accelerated technological development dramatically. Techniques developed during World War II became the foundation for Cold War electronic warfare systems. The strategic lesson of Window is that technological advantage is temporary. An enemy can and will find countermeasures if given time. The key is to exploit advantages when you have them, before the enemy adapts. Churchill's 18-month delay in authorizing Window may have cost hundreds of British lives, but it's also possible that earlier deployment would have prompted earlier German adaptation, reducing Window's effectiveness when it was finally used during Operation Gomorrah. Historians continue to debate this counterfactual. What is clear is that Window's deployment marked a turning point. After July 1943, the RAF had the initiative. German air defenses were on the defensive, scrambling to adapt to Allied innovations rather than dictating the terms of the air war. The combined bomber offensive, the joint British and American strategic bombing campaign against Germany, intensified dramatically in 1943 and 1944 window was one of several factors that made this offensive possible. Others included long-range fighter escorts, improved navigation systems, and overwhelming numerical superiority. But Window's contribution was critical. It temporarily neutralized Germany's most effective defensive system at a crucial moment. The psychological impact on German defenders was significant. The realization that radar could be defeated undermined confidence in the air defense system. By 1945, German cities had endured years of sustained bombing. The industrial damage, civilian casualties, and resource diversion contributed to Germany's eventual defeat. It's impossible to quantify exactly how much Window contributed to this outcome, but its role was substantial. Operation Window ended in August 1943, but the technology it demonstrated remains in use today, 80 years later. Modern military aircraft carry chaff dispensers as standard equipment. The chaff is now made from fine strands of fiberglass coated with aluminum, but the principle is identical to Joan Curran's 1942 design. Metal strips cut to specific lengths reflect radar waves, creating false targets. Chaff is used defensively to confuse radar-guided missiles. When an aircraft detects that it's been targeted by radar, it can dispense chaff to create a cloud of false echoes, causing the missile's guidance system to lose track of the real target. Chaff is also used offensively. Military aircraft can deploy chaff to mask their approach, making it difficult for defenders to track incoming strikes. Naval vessels use chaff to confuse anti-ship missile guidance systems. The evolution of radar technology has made chaff less effective than it was in 1943, but it remains a valuable tool. Modern radar uses sophisticated signal processing, Doppler filtering, and frequency-agile systems that can often distinguish chaff from real targets, but often is not always. In a complex combat environment with multiple targets, jamming, and countermeasures, chaff still degrades radar effectiveness. Electronic warfare has become one of the most important domains of modern military operations. Every major military invests heavily in radar, communications jamming, electronic intercept, and countermeasures. The arms race between sensors and counter-sensors continues. Window was the first widespread, operationally significant, electronic warfare countermeasure. It established the principle that electronics could be deceived, that apparent technological superiority could be undermined by clever application of basic physics. The human stories behind Window are equally important. Dr. Joan Curran received little public recognition during her lifetime. Her work was classified for decades. Only in recent years have historians fully appreciated her contribution to the Allied victory. The RAF bomber crews who deployed Window over Hamburg were ordinary men facing extraordinary danger. They flew into heavily defended airspace, knowing many would not return. Window gave them a slightly better chance of survival, and they used it to devastating effect. The German radar operators and night fighter pilots who faced Window experienced sudden, shocking obsolescence. Technology they had trusted completely suddenly failed. The advantage they had relied on vanished in a single night. They adapted as best they could, but they never regained the edge they had possessed before July 1943. The civilians of Hamburg suffered the consequences of strategic decisions made thousands of miles away, by leaders they never met, in pursuit of a war they did not start. The firestorm of July 27th to 28th, 1943, remains one of the great tragedies of World War II. The ethical questions surrounding strategic bombing are complex and remain unresolved. Was the bombing of German cities justified? Did it shorten the war? Did it save lives by weakening German industrial capacity and morale? Or did it simply cause suffering without decisive military effect? These questions have been debated for 80 years and will continue to be debated. Different people reach different conclusions based on their values, their understanding of history, and their judgment of military necessity versus humanitarian concern. What is historically clear is that Operation Window succeeded in its immediate tactical goal. It temporarily blinded German radar, reduced RAF bomber losses, and enabled more effective attacks against German targets. It also demonstrated something important about innovation in warfare. The most effective weapons are not always the most complex. Sometimes, simple solutions based on fundamental principles are more powerful than elaborate technological systems. Window was strips of aluminum foil. That's all. No electronics, no computers, no advanced materials, just metal cut to the right length and dropped from aircraft. But those simple strips of metal defeated one of the most sophisticated defense systems in the world because they exploited a fundamental vulnerability in how radar works. The lesson resonates beyond World War II. In any technological system, there are assumptions and vulnerabilities. The system designer assumes certain operating conditions. The attacker's job is to find the conditions the designer didn't account for and exploit them. Germany designed excellent radar, but didn't adequately prepare for the possibility of massive chaff deployment. That oversight created a vulnerability. Britain exploited it. Today's military planners study Operation Window as a case study in electronic warfare. They examine the technical details, the tactical implementation, and the strategic consequences. They ask, what are the modern equivalents? What systems do we rely on that might have similar vulnerabilities? What simple countermeasures might our enemies develop that we haven't anticipated? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them is essential. Technological advantage is temporary. Vigilance and adaptability are permanent requirements. The tinfoil strips that fell over Hamburg on the night of July 24, 1943, changed the course of World War II. They saved lives, destroyed a city, sparked an arms race, and taught a lesson that military forces still study today. It wasn't bombs, armor, or firepower that changed the air war over Germany. It was thousands of tiny strips of aluminum foil, fluttering silently through the darkness, reflecting radio waves, blinding radar, and proving that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful. Dr. Joan Curran died in 1999 at the age of 87. Her obituary mentioned her work on radar during World War II, but didn't explain the details, which remained classified until the 1970s. She never sought publicity for her role in developing Window, but her invention saved thousands of lives and changed military history. That legacy endures, even if her name is not widely known. The strips of aluminum foil she designed continue to fall from aircraft around the world, protecting pilots, confusing radars, and proving that the best ideas are often the simplest.